Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Teachers in the Hall podcast. I'm John Zingali. I enjoy bow ties, mixed reality, and National History Day.
And I'm Erin Lark, a literary-obsessed science teacher who's half Spock, half Kirk. And today we're taking the leap into the podcast realm with some friendly discourse on those conversations that spill out of the classrooms and into the hallways of schools across the country.
Each week, we're going to be taking a look at what's bubbling up in the hallways, both big and little things that keep the teachers talking. To start each episode, we'll be talking about a trending topic in education and dive in a little bit deeper with our thoughts on what's going on. This week, we're looking at Oregon and Utah specifically, the first two states to incorporate mental health days as options for students in need.
While this is a new practice, it's something that educators might want to pay close attention to as the school year rolls on and data about the policy use comes in those states. Other states, such as New York, are looking at adding legislation that would create similar options for their students, so we want to keep tabs on the status here in Washington, too.
So, any initial thoughts that you have, Erin, on this topic?
Well, if folks are looking to care for students and communities through policy change, I think that that's something really important. It sends the message that this is something we want for all students, and we're going to back that up with legislation.
I think it's important, too, because a couple years ago, there were some social emotional learning standards that were adopted, and it's interesting to see how those things will be implemented in states and taking into consideration the social emotional needs of those students and, who knows, maybe even teachers.
And I know that our superintendent for the state, Chris Reichdahl, has included in his budgetary plans significant funding for social emotional supports, and what that will look like in schools will be interesting to keep reading up about.
Yeah, and as the West Coast goes, when Oregon does something, Washington is usually not too far behind, and opposite way too. When Washington does something, Oregon's not too far behind, and then California is usually always in the mix, and it'll be interesting to see where things go after these states. Utah also out west. It'll be interesting to see where this leads, because it could be a little West Coast movement that moves, but then also New York. So who knows where it's going to go. I think it's interesting. I liked the fact that students can internalize what they need, and if they need that day, they're not going to be penalized for that.
I know that some of the counterpoints shared are parents who think that students will take this option as a way to avoid class time, and so that's a concern that people will also be looking at. I think it's a difficult thing to measure, because when you are dealing with mental health, in any case, you want to respect the privacy and confidentiality that is absolutely required when we're dealing with situations that are personal to people, to humans. And so the aggregate data, I think, will be really interesting after this year to take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
That
All right.
brings us to our main topic, which is near and dear to Washington State and to us.
Yes. So a little background info on Erin and I. We both teach at Vancouver iTech Preparatory. We're a PBL STEM magnet school for Vancouver School District. We have grades 6 through 12, and we're also an early college model. Our school is very unique, but there's several things that we believe in, and one is project-based learning, but then integrating STEM into everything that we do, which then enables our high schoolers to start taking college courses even as early as the freshman year. It enables us to have about a quarter of our graduates every single year have an associate's degree when they graduate high school. And so one of the things we always want to look at is how do we integrate STEM into all subjects areas, not just science and math and our technology course, or like robotics that people seem to, those are kind of the innate pieces where it fits into, but how does it fit into social studies? How does it fit into language? How does it fit into PE? And how does it fit into language arts? So I know one of the terms I hear bandied about the internet sometimes is, I did STEM today.
Oh, yeah. That's a special one. One that I often get asked to do is if I could just help someone STEMify something, as though it were a verb that you just roll out and hand or wave a wand over and you will get a result. And I think that's a little problematic, because we're missing sort of the purpose and the work behind that.
Yeah. As a social studies teacher, I don't know, this word has gone different directions with me, because I feel like a little bit left out of it because I think social studies and civics and all of these things matter. But I also think they're all a part of social studies. Technically social studies and history, they're all social sciences, where we're looking at, historic events and things and we're looking at it through this social science lens. What does this tell us about things? A lot of the processes and things I do in a social studies classroom to conduct research are similar to the scientific inquiry that you do in your classroom. So I think the idea that you need to STEMify social studies, it's not just integrating technology, it's just talking about the processes that are similar to one another and really integrating in math. Hey, you know what? I teach economics, so there's math in that. It's not just STEMifying this one little activity for kids. It's looking at the broader context and showing them the connection, I think, really between math and economics and social studies and science and how all of these different things play a role.
Absolutely. And I think that's the biggest thing that I like to share from my personal beliefs is that these subjects are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. Just as you absolutely outlined, we don't exist in this world on a large part in any sort of compartmentalized format. We don't go out in just science or just math in our jobs, whatever our jobs are. They, especially with the technological boom that we've seen in the last century, you almost can't. You have to work at it to only exist in one subject. And so really what I would love to see is teachers being enabled to no longer make that a checklist in classrooms, that the systems support them in creating a whole new environment that supports that inherent connection it's reality.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, well, I did it today. I used this piece of technology, and that's great. Like integrating technology into our students' lives, and it absolutely needs to be integrated. But we want to do so thoughtfully. It shouldn't just be like, hey, I'm just gonna like have you guys do it with this like one little piece of cool tech that I heard about. It's how can that technology foster and create something brand new? And it can really lead to deeper connections within the classroom that like I teach, but then I can draw connections into the stuff that you're doing in your classroom and into the connections that Brad's doing in his classroom and all across our school, so that kids can understand that none of these things are really in silo, because life is not a silo.
And that's absolutely fantastic. I don't think before I was on this pathway I was supported in working in an interdisciplinary format, because the umbrellas that we work under allow me to work closely with a social studies teacher, with a teacher that I might not otherwise get to do that, and really support that. And so I've come to deeply appreciate systems that are set up to do that. And at the same time, we cultivate an environment and an understanding of the learning as well. And I think that sometimes when acronyms or terms reach a market faster than do the concepts behind them, it's almost like the acronym became its own monster, and people wanted a clear-cut definition rather than an understanding of the full purpose. And so that sometimes the timing of things in education, other industries, is creating that situation that makes things difficult for people who are operating under a very different structure than we are, who still believe in the power of STEM learning, of PBL, and want to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, is like, because then all of a sudden you get these other acronyms that start showing up, like STEAM, and then now it's STREAM, and then MESH is showing up as a social studies type of one, and it's like, at some point, where does it end?
Right, exactly, because now you're so lost in the weeds of verbiage that we're no longer back at that purpose. And so really what we're thinking about is teaching with the whole in mind. And so whenever we can draw things back to a whole experience for a student, what would this look like, and recreate that the best we can given the pieces that we're working with in our school and our building in our district, I think that's where you're really getting at that inquiry you mentioned that can happen in any container of a class, but is welcoming to all of the other subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I think we do well here is we collaborate. It's such a I don't know, it's been picked up as one of these buzzwords for the teaching in the 21st century, but I just think what we do specifically at iTech, I know is unique, as you and I both have contexts we know teachers across the country and stuff. We spend, at least 3 hours a month sitting down and talking to one another and talking about different projects. I know that doesn't happen at every school, and I think that process alone, whether something innate comes out of it, we're talking to one another, we're understanding what's going on in each other's classrooms, and we can make those connections. It's easier for us to draw those connections when we're sitting and talking to one another, which then allows us to make those connections for our students, and they can see where all this stuff fits together. And understanding, like, once again, we just had huge climate change stuff happening this last week, marches and walkouts and all this stuff, and we're like, well, climate change is a science thing. Well, it's also social studies, right? Because now there's legislation and laws and all of these other things. It's also language arts. Like, there's artwork that's done about, like, teaching people to these different things. And so to say that they're not linked is, I feel, a falsehood.
Absolutely. And at the same time, we share processes during that collaboration. So the inquiry process is a cycle that can happen in math, happens in social studies, happens in science all the time. And so even the things that are not content standards that may look very different at first glance, when you look through the practices of working in subject matter, we find so many commonalities, and those really fuel that collaboration in which we share that. So in science, when I'm thinking about how does one work the STEM into my given situation, I feel like we're talking about flavors of a cake here. Teachers are really struggling to reconfigure lessons when I think it's the bigger structures where they could use that support that need the work. Because I know that in Washington, we have fantastic educators that really are the backbone of STEM graduates here, and we can be very proud of that. And I want to see those bigger structures continue to come into play through some of the excellent initiatives we have, such as the Washington STEM Network that's going to support us, and Ready Washington, and other structures, in addition to, of course, OSPI, who is strongly behind us, to allow us to get to those deeper opportunities to share and to collaborate together. And then that will come down to our buildings as well, because I know that's something that everyone embraces. And we want to use each other's resources for strengths.
And what we need to do too is, like, as a social studies teacher, it's interesting. It's like, well, how do I frame that? How do I frame this stuff within our classroom? And really, I'm a huge technology kind of nerd. I love it. But there's so many things that I've been able to implement in our building and at our school simply because I asked, why not? Like, why can't we do this? And so, as you know, like, we're the only school that I know of in the country that's an official partner with the National Park Service. And we have created a virtual reality tour for them. We've created a virtual online museum. Like, we're 3D scanning artifacts. There's this whole brand new, like, digital curation thing, which the Smithsonian did this summer. If you saw, like, Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, right? They did that. They digitally curated it so people around the world can see it. And it brings together, it infuses social studies, history, and technology. So you can have students who maybe aren't innately curious about history, but it's like, oh, well, we're going to learn how to use these new digital tools and curate things and get them to think archaeologically, which is a social science, and maybe show them how you can connect social studies, archaeology, history, technology, engineering, computer science, all of these things into something bigger than ourselves, right? We've now curated this for the world, and that's a career that's brand new. And if we can help create students that have some semblance of that, so they get to high school and college where they can dive into it even more, like, that's a career that's just going to be taking off. I'm firmly in that camp. And so we're creating that next level of student who might have a passion for technology and engineering and stuff like that, but, like, see a more practical purpose of it within a social studies realm.
And I love that I'm going to query you. There was a president who made a statement about, I ask why not. Was it one of the Kennedys? I'm going to look it up later, and we'll post it to Twitter, and we'll find it out. But there was a president who gave that same kind of idea. Like, why are you asking, what are the problems here? Why are you not asking why not?
Yeah, it's kind of like,
can't we do it?
Kennedy's big speech is like, we're going to go to the moon in this decade. Do we know how we're going to get there? No.
but
but we're
just
going to
go.
do it.
Exactly.
And I think sometimes teachers, and this is where it comes from administration. I think we have good administration at our school where it's like we're supported in this. They know that we're the experts. They allow us to do that work, right? And I think that's where administrators across the country need to back their teachers up, because we've gone to school, we've had the trainings, and we need to try some moonshot ideas sometimes.
And I would support in saying that so many administrators I've met want that for teachers. They want that for their schools, and they then need support too. And that support is a cycle that leads to the community and in how you engage with what you want to see resource-wise for schools and structures there, and industry too can come in. And you mentioned careers too, where this is evident. It made me think of the climate strikes that you were talking about. I have a lot of students who are very passionate about environmental concerns right now, and they want to start a career in activism. And we talk about, great, you have an idea, you have a passion, you have a message you want to send. You have to consider how your message will be received. Otherwise, your message may not be as effective. And so looking back over history, how is this message shared? How is it received? And then you can translate that into whatever you're doing. So you don't have to reinvent good teaching. It's really about being supported there.
Right. It's a mindset, really. I mean, most teachers kind of know how to do this. It's just whether they're willing to take that like little leap out onto that ledge and see where it goes. And I think one of the scary things as a teacher is, especially with our type of model too, is we don't know where it's going to go sometimes. And some teachers are afraid because they're held for accountability reasons, like what's going to happen. But one of the things when I've done some of my different trainings is you're going to teach a kid. The lesson may not go well. It happens all the time for us, right? But there's still learning that occurs. And so just because it wasn't the way you originally envisioned it doesn't mean we can't get to where you want it to be. And the one thing too is, are we trying to bite off more than we can chew sometimes with what the lessons that we're trying to do? We create these big magnificent things, but it's like, what's at the heart of everything that you want the kids to understand? And that's where you can bring in the STEM ideas into all of this.
Yep. So you're starting with a framework, you're making it relevant to a topic, and then you want to go big and you want to jump off that cliff. It can be easy for some to say, especially for us. It's something that's a daily practice for us, and it can be easy to hear. So really where I want to focus thoughts for people so we can start doing some advocacy for everyone is where you hit that wall with your current structures, really identifying where that happens so that we can talk about the next step. And I know someone in Texas who's had an experience that was important and along these lines.
Yeah, so they, when we look at social studies education in particular, Texas had a textbook that was put out that didn't mention the word slavery. Like, I don't know how you can teach history and not talk about that. I think they've since walked that back and changed things, but understanding slavery is understanding our country's history, and it's understanding there's racism and the science of hate, right? And what makes people act the way they do towards others. So there's that whole conversation can be really interesting, and I found that especially our middle school students, they want to try to tackle these larger issues and have conversations around all of this stuff, and we just need to give them the safe space to explore their thinking and everything like that. It doesn't always need to be lock and step. I know other Texas as an example, and there's some other states, but it's if you're not on this one page or this one lesson, or one lesson in front or one lesson behind, you're not doing the right type of teaching. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if all the students aren't understanding it, are we really doing what the students need? And so pacing, really, you need to allow yourself pacing time. As a history teacher, there is absolutely no way I can teach all of history. It's impossible. It's right. Just like you can't teach all of science.
Nope.
And so you need to prioritize that stuff. What are the big things, the big themes? That's why I like thematic teaching as well, because it's these big ideas, these big themes that students can make connections to, that they can dive into on an individual basis. So if you're studying climate change, maybe someone wants to look at rising sea levels. Maybe someone wants to study melting glaciers. Maybe someone wants to look at temperatures and all these other things that are in it. and then you can learn from one another and allow students this individual choice, and then come together and like have like a climate change symposium or something like that, and then we can talk about the laws that need to be put in place, or the ones that currently are, and how they're assisting or people in the different countries or towns or wherever you are.
And you said something really important, and part of that I think encapsulates all of what you just said, is that students want to address these things. They want to look into all of those subjects you just said. They want, and we see so much on the internet or hear on the news about disengaged students, disengaged families, and at the same time we have this collection of want that we do have. And, you know, one would think that things would flow more smoothly into, well, let's do the things they want to do. Let's incorporate more of that into our topics. And I think that it's unfortunate that some of those structures that you mentioned, such as pacing guides, that they're so prohibitive, and they are not tied into the student. You know, it's not a personal plan of growth for any child if it's something that someone did from far away and put in a box and shipped to them. I understand that we have a system that we're only in episode 1 beginning to unpack. It's very complex. Yes. About how we turn any cog in it. At the same time, I think that the question to ask is, what messages about STEM ed are being sent by the systems where you're at, and then what's being supported? So are those two different things? Are the messages coming, we want this, we want these learning environments, we want students involved, we want choice, we want the community in, we want to open our doors to industry partners to support students and give them early experiences to careers? At the same time, we are not supporting that with money, time, people, trust, you know, trust being the big one, to let that happen. And I don't want this to sound like a place of blame, but it's about narrowing down, zeroing in to those messages where they don't match, and then finding the discrepancies in those plans, or just the missing piece. Because maybe if you distill what's going on for you down to those details, you'll find an opportunity, or you'll find a place to take that advocacy and take it to the person who is in charge, or the group that is in charge of helping you make that happen. That way that we are coming up with these plans for STEM education that go somewhere, that are inherent to the way that we operate schools, and we can articulate them to anyone who comes to the school and tell them, here's what we're doing, here's how, here's all the awesome support we have, and more importantly, here's all the awesome student work that's coming out of it that
Right.
they've driven.
And I think one of the big pieces is when you're talking about like the people aspect of this, because a lot of times it's hard to, like, where do you start, where do you begin, right? And you need that extra kind of support. I know our district has implemented where there's a mentor for the first year, for all first year teachers here, right? And I know that's a program that's starting to be implemented. Even I think Reichtal talked about it in his messaging. Like, we want these mentors, fellow teachers that are good at what they do, to help bring along young educators so that they can understand these processes. And the same thing goes for this type of thinking, right? If we want our students to get out there and try to learn new things, I think we need to try to also emulate that with our own personal growth. And, you know, if we have questions, like, go out there and try it out. Like, find someone that you might be able to bounce an idea off of, or, you know, reach out to communities, because there's type of STEM or PBL communities, they exist, whether they're on Twitter or Facebook and all of these things, even within your school probably. And it's just walking down the hall and having that conversation.
And one of my favorite things to do whenever I meet someone new and hear about their industry is say, hey, what problems do you have? Because in asking a true industry professional who's living it, what that is, it often catches them off guard, because they're not used to someone caring about what they go through in X industry. But when you do that, you really find the true problems that students can have an effect on. So I know of some great work that happened up in Sammamish, where a teacher queried that of the community and found that a lot of the large toys like the cars that are driven by kids that are made of plastic in various colors at Christmas are not made for students with different abilities. And so she took her technology class and they completely reprogrammed the cars, restructured them, made them accessible for kids. That's huge. That's real. And it was instantly put into place by that company. They're now working on making that align. Right. I had some students a couple years ago who asked, well, if I'm a person with a different body type or a different ability, how is the way that I fasten my clothes going to limit my wardrobe? And so they designed an entire fashion line of clothes that were specifically keyed to people with different abilities, because there are things that you might not think about if you don't ask. So I always stress that people should bring in industry folks wherever they can into the discussion. What do they want, not just from STEM grads in general, those awesome soft skills, but what problems are they facing and what do they see coming up in the future that they, maybe are just starting to chew on.
Right. And the idea of creating something for mass consumption too, right? If you're making public products and you're teaching your kids like, hey, we're going to make this. I know that's where working with National Park Service has changed my philosophy on everything, because everything needs to be accessible, right, for people of all abilities. And so whenever we create something, we're trying to do the audio and the text and stuff like that so people can interact with it of all abilities. And then our students see like, oh yeah, like this is something I need to think about at all times. And I think this is where you can integrate in a lot of technology too, because technology allows us these easier methods of bringing everything together. But you get kids starting to think about these issues in different ways. And I think we had a student, she's working on like creating paint that's scented for people who are hard of seeing, right, and blind people, because how do they do art, right? How do they know what colors they're using and stuff like that? And so her idea was, hey, if we make it scented, we might be able to like help them out a little bit and stuff like that. And that's a big idea. We're making a tactile Rubik's Cube, so you can actually see. Or
it was right up our students'
right.
alley.
No, actually, we have a former student that did that,
Yes.
right? And that's just like through this process of going through the school and this inquiry and learning about these different things and integrating STEM into social things. And I think they worked with their dad works at the VA or something like that, so that's where they came into contact with some of these people, mm-hmm. right? So they're integrating in all of these different content areas and pieces of the world around them to help come up with a solution of something that they're passionate about. They just happen to like Rubik's Cubes, like, hey, how can we help more people find a passion for something we love about?
I love it. And that brings me to one of my favorite things about STEM work is that it's ingrained in humanity. You can't help but find a stronger connection to humanity when you're working in this integrated format with all of these pieces going on. You only build connections and you only reach out. That network gets bigger for you because your understanding of the world gets bigger. And your quest and your questions only continue. And as a science teacher, I only want more questions.
Absolutely. So I think we're about the end of our first inaugural podcast. Woo! Yay! We did it. So one of the things we want to pose out to everyone else too is what are questions you have or good teaching strategies that you have within your classrooms, because we want to leverage our audience, because we know that as my grad teacher said, all of us are smarter than one of us. And the more people we reach out to, the more connections that we can make, the more strategies we can bring into our classroom. So each episode we're going to kind of like end with a question, but this one is like, what are the strategies that you do in your classroom, or what help do you need in your classroom to implement stuff like that?
Absolutely. And so in telling us the STEM status in your neck of the woods, we want to hear what's working, what changes need to happen, what do you need to hear about or hear from other people about.
And so some of the ways you can reach out to us, you can reach us on our email, teachersinthehall@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook page, Teachers in the Hall, and Instagram, and I think Twitter as well. Yeah, we've got our social media working. It's still in its infancy, but should be growing, and we'll start to pop out some of the questions that we have as well on those platforms. But then you can reach us there too, and we hopefully will start to take some of those answers and nuggets that we glean from all of this and start our episodes with that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for listening.
Have a great day.